Greetings and welcome to webinar number 4 for the effects of simple role-playing games on the wargaming step of the military decision-making process. I'm Dr. Rich McConnell, and I'm joined with my colleagues Dr. Ken Long and Mr. Joel Miller. And we're talking about the findings today for our study. As we've been discussing throughout our webinar series is what is visualization and how people engage in this process. We talked last time that the stimuli that we provided was the early 1800s German Kriegspiel, and we used a visualization quiz. And we also tried to measure the effects not only through game theory variables but also through a wargaming observation form for faculty members to watch and see how many discoveries were made and how easily were those discoveries incorporated into planning. And really what we're going to discuss for the next few minutes is the results of our data collection and how that data collection was analyzed. So without any further ado, let me hand this over to Mr. Joel Miller and let him discuss the first portion of it.
So up front, what we've discovered is that our findings suggest that if we continue to practice visualization skills as leaders and planners, that will support improved abilities to visualize, improved comfort with visualization based on decisions that we need to make or that we should make, and it should improve the ability to recognize and seize opportunities in a timely manner when we have to address threats in military planning, or when we want to integrate additional components to our planning that we discover that we may have overlooked or not considered as appropriately or as effectively in the planning process itself. So when we implemented the visualization quiz, we used 2 graders for the quiz, and we looked qualitatively. It was a qualitative instrument that, to rate students on their ability to visualize. And really the bottom line here is the test group outperformed the control group in that quiz, recalling what they had seen, and especially in regards to recalling the locations of friendly units, how they saw themselves and their friendly associated units versus the control group. We did see some variances in the grading of this quiz based on the particular grader, and we were concerned that may impact our test results, but we looked very closely at both test and control groups and how that grader graded across each of the groups that he implemented the quiz for, and discovered that his results were statistically the same, and we therefore deemed it unlikely that his results would have impacted the study in a significant way. What we found when we implemented the visualization quiz was for questions 3, 5, 6, and 7, the statistical differences were graded. One judged respondents more strictly overall in those cases, and we used a Friedman's 2A analysis to rank those questions. The Mann-Whitney-Wilcoxon test we used returned results for Rater 1 in part one of the student visualization quiz, it showed a statistical significance for question 6. What friendly elements are operating on or on the near side of the river? And then Rater 1 graded the student visualization quiz, returning results of statistical significance using that the Mann-Whitney-Wilcoxon test, specifically in regards to question 5A. What is the size, composition, and scheme of maneuver of friendly marine effort? And really what this tells us, if you think of this in terms of Sun Tzu, and Sun Tzu's, one of his maxims was, if you know the enemy, know yourself and know the terrain. Really what we've done here is students are able to look at an understanding of the terrain, which is really always constant, themselves, and the enemy, which is really the variable that constantly changes. And we've given the student the ability to look at two of those three variables, self and terrain, and understand where they are in terms of the terrain, and they now have a greater ability to visualize or anticipate what the enemy might do based on understanding two of those three variables more specifically and more deeply.
Okay. For the visualization quiz, we combined what the student could recall with how comfortable they felt at making choices based on their visualization. And we applied game theory variables to do this. and the interesting thing about the visualization quiz is sort of it's a mixed methods instrument that basically asks the students some qualitative judgments that they must make based on their own visualization. But we then applied a quantitative methodology by assigning number ranks to the quality of their answer. So in a lot of ways it was qualitative in that they had to show some subjective judgments, and the graders had to show some subjective judgments on how good their answer was, how accurate. And then we assigned number rankings to those, and then we did the same thing with game theory variables. And so we found that the test seemed more confident than the control group in the specific game theory variable of knowledge was common to them. It was common knowledge they were being asked to draw upon in order to answer the question. So specifically in the part 2 of the quiz, but also in part 1, they, although not statistically significant, but was notable that they felt they had enough information, certainty, rationality, and the knowledge required was common to them in part 1. So in general, across the board, the test group did outperform the control when it came to confidence levels using the game theory variables and being able to make decisions based on visualization. So here's the findings of the visualization quiz from statistical perspectives. So if you look at the research report, which will be part of the proceedings of this conference in March, you'll be able to look at all the specific data, but these are the scores. So because we used the numbers displayed there to conduct our statistical tests, we were able to establish, when I say statistically significant results, we're saying that there's really one chance in 20 that this was due to chance that these things occurred, which of course conversely then would be there's 19 chances in 20 that this is a trend that could be potentially replicated in a larger group. And that's one of the things that I really kind of feel that I need to address as far as the statistics of this is a mixed method study. Okay, so if we really wanted, from a quantitative perspective, the bigger the N, the bigger the group of people that we have, the better. And of course, our test group was only 32 people, and our control group was 79. So, so that doesn't maximize the strength for quantitative, but it's still significant and worthy of note, and sets the foundation for further examinations where the ends could be bigger. And part of that was because logistically, just doing a test or doing a game of Kriegspiel takes 4 hours for 16, the way we do it here at the school. So if we had more time to invest during our academic year, this would be, we'd be able to do more. Or if we could train more people to actually run the game, that would also make this more opportunities for study. But yeah, this is preliminary in nature, and some at other institutions, both civilian and military, might look at this and go, why would I want to use this as an approach? And we'll get a little more specific towards the end of our webinar here. But the bottom line is that this whole thing started was because we saw students go and play this game, and then came back and they did a really good job, one of the best I'd ever seen, at stress testing their plan through the wargaming step of the military decision-making process. And we wanted to find out if there was any kind of correlation between playing this fairly simple analog simulation, really. I mean, and this is an interesting thing to consider. I mean, in today's day and age, we think simulations are great, and I am a big believer in them. But I also think that there's something to be gained from simple simulations and analog solutions. What we found in the military is simulations are very time-consuming, they're costly, but some of these more simple analog simulations, such as Kriegspiel and others, gives us potentially whatever part of the brain that governs visualization exercises that. And we've been able to show that their recall skills and their confidence levels are statistically significant, and specifically in being able to see themselves, which is a big challenge, and being comfortable making choices with their visualization, thinking that what they've been asked was common knowledge.
So, as we looked at the wargaming process for both the test and the control group, what we discovered was that the test group had a statistically significant advantage in identifying both the number of perceived threats and opportunities by warfighting function during their wargame process versus the control group. And in addition, what we observed was, or what the faculty observed was, that they had a much easier time integrating those opportunities and mitigating those threats across more warfighting functions during their wargame. As the complexity grew, they seemed to be able to work through those issues much more efficiently, or input more, take advantage of more opportunities as a part of their wargaming their plan much more efficiently, based on the fact that they had played Kriegspiel as a board game, and then were able to better see themselves and anticipate what the threats might do.
Okay, so kind of wrapping this discussion up, we found that this was an interesting discovery for us as military educators, to discover that visualization seems to be a combination of skills that include creativity, critical thinking, anticipation, forecasting, and ability to predict based on maybe what you can't see, but there are clues, and that you can get better at this, you can improve. And it doesn't have to be complicated to do this. Some of these, there could be ways to study this phenomenon, a number of ways using, you don't have to use Kriegspiel. I would venture to assert, that would be something that someone else could potentially study. Civilian decision makers and planners might find these findings transferable to their organizations. I mean, if we're bringing a product to the market, and if we improve our visualization skills, potentially we might be able to anticipate threats and opportunities to our business opportunities that we're trying to pursue, and then anticipate them and come up with mitigating strategies to maximize outcomes and benefit our bottom line. And specifically for us, is things that we're doing here in the tactics department at the Command and General Staff College. Our results were noticed by some colleagues who we used to have something in the about 20, 30 years ago, when some of us were starting in the military, something called tactical decision-making games. And when we started to get more simulations, a lot of these simple analog games went away, and in favor of these major simulation activities. The problem is those simulations are expensive, time-consuming, and complex. And so if your only time to exercise your visualization skills are at those, you may come into those experiences not maximizing the benefit you could receive from them because you're starting from scratch and maybe not adequately prepared to become to maximize the training or learning experience. So now what's next? We're going to have one more, fifth and final webinar, and we'll discuss some of the things that we considered for potential further study. This process was a very interesting discovery process for those of us on the research team, and we came up with some proposals for future study. Some of them having to do with culture of organizations and gaming. Some having to do with the nature of planning processes and how the gaming like this might be able to help that. And then we also kind of considered, as I've mentioned, is that sometimes simulations are wonderful, but they aren't the answer for everything. And perhaps if we do use simulations, the way we prepare the people who are going to go through such an interactive experiential learning process might be better prepared if we use more simple analog approaches prior to a complicated simulation. And studying this would be, I think, a worthy pursuit for a lot of folks who are not just military, but civilian and business and educational, because it gets people in the affective domain. People naturally are turned on by, are accessed and engaged by games on a competitive level. And so when you get people in that kind of affective domain, you can benefit and get them to improve their visualization skills, potentially affecting our ability to anticipate that which is not seen but is coming.
Yeah, this is Ken Long. Let me put today's webinar in a maybe a wider context and describe why I think it's so important. These guys are taking on the qualities of true believers in simulations, and I'm certain that they're getting a positive educational effect on their students. Part of that, I think, has to do with their willingness to do these things, their expertise, their enthusiasm for it, and so there's a certain halo effect, a Hawthorne effect that carries over, and that probably contributes to some of the learning, some would say. But now I want to shift to the point of view of the dean of our college, our course director. So he's got the personal responsibility to ensure that 1,500 officers every year are educated in this 1 year to leave the Army for the rest of their career. 95% of all general officers in the future will have come through this particular school, and so the responsibility to do the best for the profession on behalf of the nation is at the top of his mind. So while he can tolerate having a couple of true believers teaching 30 or 40 guys, when it comes to making a programmatic decision on what to do with the education of 1,500 people, he's got some real choices. He has some resources to say we could go with an elaborate, sophisticated, costly technical war game. We could go strictly small analog games, as these guys have shown a way to do that, or we might avoid simulation altogether and use traditional methods of lecture, or we might flip the classroom. Any number of choices that are reasonable and defendable, and he's got to make a decision on the basis of value and cost. And so what is important about this study is that set aside their personal beliefs about the efficacy of gaming and have shown a structured way to approach the evaluation of developing qualitative judgment and the reliability of the treatment being statistically significant better than the test is a reason why a dean could feel comfortable or confident in expanding the scale of the next round of experiments to go to some guys that are not gamers and see if the same results obtain, or to compare this against a more structured technology-driven simulation. So the fact that we have actual evidence allows us presumably to make some decisions on the basis of that evidence. And so the structure of their assessment plan, I think, is every bit as important as the particular insights from the treatment, especially if you're looking at trying to do this inside your own profession or your own program where you have to convince somebody else on the basis of hard data. So some attention to detail on how they've structured this experiment is useful. I want to say something about the problem of big data and the challenge of big data. So for a long time, our profession was based on intuitive judgment of the commander. In the last 30 years, with the advent of technology and the ability to acquire data and the trust in quantitative measures, you can argue that a lot of our innate, intuitive, natural warfighting judgment is being replaced with rules and expert systems and quantitative methods. And we actually see a decline in the ability of students to visualize and act on the basis of informed judgment, artistic judgment. There's a trust in science to the detriment of the appreciation of art. So one of the ways that you have to try to gain an edge in the world is to get to a solution quicker. And our brain has been selected by natural selection and evolution to reward those who can come up with the best answer in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of data. So we have a brain that leaps to fill in the pattern on the basis of scant evidence. Taken too far in a complicated world, you get bad judgment or bad rules of thumb. So we've tended to distrust that. So what we're looking for here are ways in which we can reliably, cost-effectively, develop those visualization skills that will help us trust that coup d'oil, that leap of faith, that gestalt that ties things together, that allows us to gain an advantage over someone who maybe is relying on big data and absolute confirmation and 100% certainty. So there's a window of opportunity in there for our commanders and officers to become effective decision makers. Now, as an example of how we approach this as a profession, in 1980, before the advent of computer simulations in our school, there was a 100-page rule book that was used by referees to compute the results of battles and then to adjudicate the results of war games. It was time-consuming, required expert judgment on the part of the faculty. All of that got incorporated into giant, costly, centralized simulations, and all of that human judgment in the hands of the referees disappeared. With more power on PCs, that large-scale simulation has been replaced with smaller PC-driven applications. Next year, we're talking about doing away with all those and going back to plans and human judgment to get more iterations. And we are facing a crisis of experience and practical craft knowledge and how to adjudicate war games. So the faculty now, not just the students, are going to be trying to develop visualization skills to determine if our plans are any good. So not only are we trying to develop professional skills in our students, we have to bootstrap ourselves as faculty and start developing this visualization muscle. And so to be able to point to a particular method and to show actual evidence of efficacy is a very important part of this discussion when it comes to judging how we should organize this professional development on behalf of the nation and its 1,500 officers every year. And so that's why I'm really excited about the power of this of this program and the importance of this study inside our professional setting. One thing I would, just a couple design comments for you guys in the audience to consider and for you guys to think about, is this idea of the importance of calibrating the judgment of the graders. And we saw there a slight difference in their judgment. And so one of the things that typically goes into the design is how are we going to calibrate through the use of a rubric and test cases the judgment of those graders. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your ideas on that or your experiences with it.
That was an interesting learning experience for us. You know, in many ways, doing the study itself is just as much teaching us who are doing the research as anything else, because we had to overcome some obstacles, you know, that were, some of which were unforeseen. And you're right, there was a difference between the two graders. The two graders had different experiences, different ages, came from different communities within the military, had different life experience, etc. And so, you know, we should have anticipated that there'd be, in some ways, they were close for certain things, and in other ways they weren't. And so, assigning number rankings was the key, because then we could use statistical analysis to see just what it meant, you know, the differences that we found. And the key is that we were worried that the one grader number one, was the one that showed statistical significance for seeing themselves, whereas grader number two really didn't have statistical significant outcomes. But by using the tests that we applied, we discovered that grader one graded instruments more strictly than grader two. So that we were able to surmise from that is, well, that might mean that it's unlikely that the outcome of statistical significance from grader number one was because they were, you know, biased to score participants higher for certain things in the test group. It seems to me, now that there may be a number of other explanations. And the other thing too, and while I'm addressing this, I'd like to kind of talk about, we worried about the Hawthorne effect. We did look at that and go, gee, are we going to you know, be influenced by bias? Are we going to you know, so for example, the test group, by virtue of the rules that the Department of Defense has in place for human subjects research, we had to inform everyone what we were doing. Okay, so this was not a double blind where people didn't know, hey, you're the test group. People didn't know they're the control. Mm-hmm. They knew, okay? So if you didn't play Kriegspiel, but what that, you know, we decided from that was, because we were required to do that by regulation, it also leveled the playing field, because the test group and the control group probably wanted to do their best. So they're probably equally going to do as best they can. And so is it perfect? No. And would it be interesting to do a subsequent study and see if we could get approval to conduct a double blind? That might be a good idea. Administratively, it'll take more time, and something we will have to look into next time. But yeah, I still think that these findings are significant and worthy of consideration for what they tell us about gaming and its impact on planning and visualization, and also what other people might be able to learn from it for other disciplines within other communities.
Yeah, and you and I had that discussion a little bit before we came in to start this recording, and the the opportunities, not just in the business world or the education world, but perhaps even in the medical community and medical disciplines, in determining what part of cognitive functions or brain functions do those students who seem to quickly have that coup d'eil and quickly grasp opportunities and threats with minimal information, what part of their cognitive functions are they using, and how we might design curricula or training programs or business programs to better enable and exercise that cognitive function among any student or any employee for long-term development in the process.
And the so what of this is, if you can anticipate what's coming next before whoever it is you're competing against, that has great ramifications for seizing opportunities and addressing threats before they address you. So if you can do that in a business environment, perhaps you can beat out your competitors to the market with a product that maybe they haven't thought of. Medical professionals may find this useful. I mean, they visualize. I mean, they have a whole host of clues, but they've got to somehow string those clues together to surmise what is going on with this patient, and what part of the brain does that function reside in. And the same thing for education. I mean, we don't know. I mean, if you just look at the world situation right now, there's all kinds of threats, potential threats, sitting out there from not just a military, but also from a governmental perspective. I'm sure there are people in the State Department trying to figure out what's going to happen next with North Korea, what's going to happen next with Russia, and how do we anticipate what's coming next. And I think that is directly related to visualization, and being able to help those leaders improve that skill might be invaluable.
I'd like to just put a little teaser in here by way of summary for another session we're going to do at the pre-conference workshop, and that is the idea of co-creation of games between students and faculty as a way of developing these kinds of skills. And so, in one sense, you want the grader to get it right, to perfectly understand the rubric and perfectly apply it. So you have a conversation among the graders about what the rubric means and what right looks like. Well, in a professional setting, you're trying to create that kind of judgment and understanding in the student's mind as well. And when we look at scaling this up to 1,500 students and not just 30 students, and we may run out of faculty too soon, it's reasonable to ask, what can we do with collaborative learning and peer instruction to make the students part of the evaluation process? We know that a good rubric that's explained to students has a learning value in the communication. And so we can take this a step further. Just this morning, I took that 1980s rule book of the analog rules from the old tabletop war game and took a subset of that, the logistics for time and distance management for distribution. And I'm developing an analog war game with the students as part of the ongoing curriculum. It's a game that we want to play, and they're helping me design the rules and come up with what the rubric ought to look like and what the standards ought to be. And in the development of the simulation itself, the students are getting a learning value that's better than if I lecture to them about history or the principles of distribution. So the act of collaboration and asking the what-if kinds of questions, and the creation of the rubric, involving the professional student in the development of the simulation offers some tantalizing prospects for improved educational effectiveness. And that's something we'll cover in a separate part of the workshop when we get to the pre-conference. It's the third or fourth time that I've actually involved the students in the development of the game that we want to play and then play it. And what we've seen so far is that the maybe most of the value comes out of the design of the game as compared to the play of the game for that particular group. The games turn out to be fun to play because participants designed it. But the learning value of developing the game causes them to visualize different choices. It seems to be activating the same kinds of muscles that the game of Kriegspiel, for example, teach it. So I think we're just scratching the surface of what we can do with the simplest possible games that can be turned in the quickest amount of time so that we can feed forward into the next round of design and dialogue among professionals. Since we're certain that there are no absolute right answers in our business anyway, we think that a lot of the dialogue and the back and forth between students and faculty is where the real learning occurs. And so to the extent we can get students involved inside that kind of discussion, it postures them to do the same thing when they go back to the field, and then they're in charge of developing training and simulation for their own units. So we actually want them thinking like faculty, like designers, in order to seize opportunities. And I think all of that's connected to visualization. So I'm going to kick it back over to the guys for any closing comments before we call this a good day at work.
Okay. Well, the only thing I'd just say in conclusion is I can't agree more with Dr. Long regarding the designer perspective. I've discovered, the way some people used to run exercises in the military was a way of kind of surprising the training audience, right? Finding ways to, defeat them in different ways. But I have discovered here in CGSC, when I involve the students in the designing of their own learning environment, taking responsibility for it, and even designing interventions that challenge them. I've discovered that they love doing that. And now you don't end up with finger pointing when a challenge comes and they find themselves struggling. It's actually exciting. It's like, oh, okay, great. And the other one here is creating a learning environment where it's safe to fail. In the military, we equate failure with, death. Failure equals, being, it has a very real mortality effect on you as a combatant. But being able to set the conditions where someone can make a mistake in a training or learning environment so that they don't make that later on, I think is invaluable. Because I have discovered that students tend to learn better from the things that they fail at than the things that they succeed at.
Yeah, I would echo those comments. I think you also see that students become there's a deeper accountability to each other, vice an accountability only to the educator. And the learning now is across student experiences and not just dictated by an educator experience or an educator's drive to get through particular milestones in the curriculum.
Sure.
Well, that concludes our presentation for webinar 4 of 5. We almost sad to see this coming to an end, but we want to get this out to you, and we look forward to continuing this discussion with you at the workshop in March. Take good care. Send us your questions and comments. We're happy to reply. Thanks, guys.